All good. Right. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Soureya Setal, who's going to present the findings from a dissertation she did for MSc in Public Health and Health Promotion about a year ago.
Over a year.
Over a year. So Soureya was one of the interesting group of students we had who would have normally done primary data collection kind of project, but there was this thing called COVID, which kind of interrupted. And so this was your first introduction to HG, particularly interesting data set, ELSA. So over to you, Soureya, in your own time, with your own equipment.
Only a point of it, yeah. So thank you, everyone. Yeah, as Christina said, I'd like to thank Brunel University London for letting me come and present this information. If I could do an entire slideshow about Prof Victor, I probably would as well if I was allowed. I'm indebted to her for supervising this research as well. And welcome to the people online as well. So why did I even think about looking at religion? Prof Victor mentioned that this is something that's not really studied. So in terms of loneliness, many of you in the audience know that social well-being is really important for health across the life course, whether you're young or you're older. And in the UK, in England, we already know from Prof Victor's work with colleagues that we have a prevalence of 10.9 to 11.5%. So it is an issue in the UK, it is a public health issue here. And I understand from the incredible presentations earlier that you're fully versed in what loneliness is, but I appreciate some people, this might be a slightly newer area for them. But loneliness is defined as an emotion, and it results from this difference between what you expect to have from your relationships, be they through a network or through intimacy and a sense of belonging. So this is kind of this idea of emotional loneliness and what you actually have in reality. So religion is worth exploring as possibly an antecedent to loneliness or something that might moderate it. And why might that be? Well, some of the obvious reasons might just be that when you're going to ceremonial events, so for example, a christening or a funeral, you're getting people together. If you're going for regular worship at a certain time of week on a certain day, you might also, if you have a religion, identify that as sort of a belief. It gives you some meaning, some purpose in life, and you share that with other people. And from my own reading, although it's not presented here, there was this kind of thread through particularly at end of life and how that impacts your end of life quality of care as well, particularly if you are in, say, something like a hospice or family members having to make decisions together around end of life care. And Prof Victor noted that there was limited recent research into the relationship between loneliness and religion and or spirituality, and also those who don't have any religious beliefs or a spiritual belief either. So why is it particularly relevant though to older people? Well, religion and or spirituality shares this overlap with loneliness regarding the social, so the network base, the emotional, that feeling, and existential dimension through its concepts of belonging and, as I mentioned, meaning and purpose. And in England, for older adults, we know from the 2021 data that 43% of the population identified as Christian. So this is just having an identity, saying, I'm a Christian. This has nothing to do with how often you practice, what you believe, what denomination, anything like that. It's just, I'm a Christian. We know that actually 40% of the population in England was Jewish. We know that in terms of no religious affiliation, we had 18% who were identified as having no religious affiliation. And you can see the breakdown for the other major religions such as Muslim, Buddhist and Sikh as well. So just to clarify, there is an issue for older people in the UK around religion because there are many people who are 50 and over who still practice a religion despite what may be what is reported in the media. So how do we then, if we have this definition for loneliness, how do we define religion and spirituality? Well, as Prof Victor mentioned in the beginning, the US are pretty hot on this topic, and they have, Kochalski is known for this definition, that is the aspect of humanity that refers to the way individuals seek and express meaning and purpose, and the way they experience their connectedness to the moment, to self, to others, to nature, and to the significant or sacred. So there's a lot that is encompassed in that definition, and it's trying to show you that religion and or spirituality are not one on the same thing, and different people have different interpretations based on that. And therefore, it is important to actually have measures of both. Because, for example, someone that meditates may have a meditation through a spiritual connection. Someone who goes to prayer may have a connection through a deity. And they're very different in what their interpretations might be and how they're perceived as well. And so religion might be seen more as an external expression, so often with a community, whereas spirituality may be something that's more inward. And you can have both as well. That's the other interesting point. And it's how much does research distinguish them as separate or looking at them together. So when we think about how religion and spirituality are actually measured, if we wanted to sort of look at the data, religious affiliation is saying, I'm a Christian, I'm a Muslim, I have no religion, I'm an atheist, I'm an agnostic. Okay. So in the UK here currently, we have the Religion Harmonised Standard, and it asks you questions generally about religion on 3 aspects, which I'll show you in a moment. And one of them is identity. And it's a simple question. You're asked, what is your religion? And you have a list of options and you can select which one you identify with. And they define religious identity or belonging to a religion as a current or past individual or familial connection with the religion. So for example, you might see someone who says, well, my parents were Muslim, so I'm Muslim. Or when I was born, I was christened, so I guess I'm Christian. And that would perhaps be something that's a weak affiliation, whereas someone who regularly is going to church or regularly observing the Sabbath, that is someone who might declare that they have a stronger affiliation with that. Then you have the other construct of religious attendance. So in the United States, Prof Victor mentioned at the beginning, they are asked about questions on religion. And one of the questions that is asked is, how often do you attend church or other religious meetings? And then finally, there's religious practice and belief. And this is quite difficult to measure because now you're starting to try and understand how meaningful or how much does this actually affect your life, influence your life, benefit or not benefit your life. And so, for example, in a spirituality scale, you might be asked about your religious well-being, but also you might be asked existential questions such as, I see the sacredness of everyday life, or I meditate to gain access to my inner self. And they might ask questions again, how you feel about nature, how you feel in connectedness to other people, but in a spiritual way of thinking. And I suppose one of the questions that I had from looking at the research and the data is that, is this part of all religions and all spiritual beliefs? Is it simply saying, I am someone who is spiritual, I attend a meditation class every week, and I see the sacredness of life? Is it as simple as that? Or actually, are certain aspects of spirituality or certain aspects of religion not covered in this? Not all religions need you to go to a place of worship at a specific time. Is that covered in these measures? So already there are issues in actually comparing the data. So the study question that I had to answer was, what is the relationship between loneliness and religion and or spirituality in older adults in England? And so I used the study that one of your colleagues mentioned, I think on the social, on the mobility machine learning study, which was the English longitudinal study of aging, which is ALSA. And I apologize, I should have put a big logo up and again, respected my esteemed thanks to the group, because personally, as a layman, it's a phenomenal data set. Someone to research and new to aging, just to have a data set of over 12,000 adults and so many aspects of their life are recorded. It's done over biennially, so every 2 years, and it's been running since 2002. And so we're at the current wave 10, and the amount of information you get from it is just absolutely unbelievable. And so how it works is participants undergo a computer-assisted face-to-face interview, which is still amazing, I think, in this day and age, to still go and see someone, followed by a self-completion questionnaire, and there's also a nurse assessment. So that can be certain things like taking blood tests or measuring height or weight. And it also takes into account demographic, economic expectations, health and behaviours, psychosocial, cognitive function data are all recorded, but not everything is recorded at every single wave. So not everything is every 2 years. And so from my own study, religion and spirituality has only been measured in waves 5, and the most recent one was wave 9. And so my data is from 2018 and 2019. So wave 9 itself had a total of 8,736 people. And of those, 7,000, just over, were core members. What a core member means, and for the rest of this presentation, is somebody who's filled out and answered the questions themselves. It's not a partner that has sat with them, or they've not had someone else answer on their behalf. And so in the data set that I use, where they record religion and where they record loneliness, so the exposures and the outcomes, it is in the returned self-completion questionnaire. And for this data set, 6,397 of those core members had returned that questionnaire. And then in the sample that I analysed, the analytic sample, that was comprised of all the people who had actually answered all 3 parts of the loneliness scale, the UCLA one. And that's why we ended up with an analytic sample of 6,225. And so in the research, the dependent variable was loneliness. And again, it was using this 3-item UCLA loneliness scale. And I'll show you those questions in the next slide for those who aren't familiar. And one of the perhaps advantages of that question is the idea is that by not mentioning loneliness within that 3-item scale, or the words lonely, it kind of reduces the stigma of being asked that question, particularly perhaps in a face-to-face interview, which is something you might want to consider. And the scores are marked from 1 to 3, hardly ever or never, scoring 1, some of the time or often up to 3. And so you get a score of 3 to 9. So 3 questions, maximum score is 3. And for the purposes of the research, I use this as a categorical variable, which allowed me to split people into groups of who declared they were lonely and who declared they were not lonely. And that was based on a threshold, because it's a feeling. How do you tell if you're lonely or not lonely? You have to find a way to score it. Again, research from 2020, we used a demarcation that a score of 3 to 5, so at the lower end, you're saying that actually I'm not that lonely, but a 6 to 9, yes, I'm lonely. And so here is the actual scale. The Cronbach's alpha for my study was 0.84, so pretty reliable for our study. And in the literature, it's reported as 0.72. And the 3 questions with the stars are the ones that are actually part of the 3-item UCLA loneliness scale. So how often do you feel you lack companionship? How often do you feel left out? And how often do you feel isolated from others? And one thing to note is in the UCLA loneliness scale, they don't combine hardly ever or never. And so in the ELSA data set, they're combined. So that's why there's 1 of 3 options. But also the Office for National Statistics in the United Kingdom, when for their own research, they also ask a single item question, which again, you might be more familiar with, is how often do you feel lonely? And so this is just 1 question, but it's the same options available. And in the results, I'll show you what people did mark for this one as well. In terms of how ELSA asked about religion, it's really difficult. In the UK, I couldn't find an actual validated scale, something comparable with the UCLA loneliness scale. And the United States has got one, but here we don't necessarily have one. And it seems like this is drawn a little bit from some of the US and part of the ONS as well. But again, it splits it down into these three questions of what is your religion? How often have you attended religious services during the past year? So it's recency within a year. And again, that's in a time frame of more than once a week, 2 or 3 times a month, once or more times a year, or not at all. And then you have questions around religious or spiritual beliefs. And it says tick how you feel, how best you feel about each statement. And you either strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree. And the questions are: religious faith is extremely important to me. Again, we have issues with wording here in terms of extremely important. I pray or meditate daily. I look to religion to provide meaning and purpose in my life. I consider myself active in organised religion, so going to church, temple, mosque, and those are the ones that Elsa asks. So again, in the research, because I was looking at nominal data, so for those who are very familiar with statistics, unlike I was, you will understand that. But in terms of when you're putting things into a computer, it needs to understand it in a specific language. And certain tests only work with certain words. And so I converted this to categorical and ordinal variables for religious attendance to see if merely going somewhere made a difference, or actually going quite often to a place of worship made more of a difference, or no difference at all. And so for the purposes of regression, religious attendance was dichotomized as I attend or I don't attend. And for religion, I have a religion or I don't have a religion. And for religious practice, again, the agreement statements were combined and the disagreement statements were combined. And then to kind of account for, like the previous question around socioeconomic factors, I accounted for age, gender, ethnicity, marital status, income sufficiency, employment, education, physical health, long-standing illness, social network. And just to explain social network in a bit more detail, that was civic membership. So if you're a member of another organisation or a club, a sports club or a political group or something like that, and number of organisational meetings attended in a year, because obviously if I'm looking at attendance at a place of worship, you could argue that's a meeting. And so people that don't have religion may attend other types of meetings. So how does that influence the data? So in terms of the results, hopefully that was pretty clear. Just looking at what the data set entailed, just over 50% were female. The mean age was 68. The majority, 96%, were white. 63% were in relationships, so they were married or with a civil partner. 85% had children. 69% were retired, so had previously been in work. 67% were involved with other organisations. And in terms of sort of income, there's lots of information, and Elsa does ask in great detail, of course, economic circumstances. But we looked at the question that was asked, which is very simple. Do you feel your income is sufficient? So, and that is to do sort of like your day-to-day living, I guess, your expenses and so on. And so 82% of this sample said that, yes, they have enough money. And 75% rated their health as excellent, very good, or good. So they were doing pretty well. In terms of their loneliness, the prevalence measured by a score, as I mentioned, the two groups of 6 or more, was 16.5% for the core sample and 19.3% in the analytical. So if you remember, the analytical is people that have answered those loneliness questions, and every single one, there's no missing data for those. And the mean loneliness score was actually 4, so not lonely. In the UK ONS, I mentioned that single item question that is asked: how often do you feel lonely? And in this question, 23% said they felt lonely some of the time, and 6% felt lonely often. And it suggests that there's high reported loneliness when asking the single item as compared to asking the 3-item UCLA. And that's interesting, because I just told you the advantage of 3-item is it doesn't say you're lonely. And the idea is so that you reduce the stigma, and yet more people were happier with a single question to say, actually, I am. So this was all inputted to look at in the different areas, as I mentioned, who had a religion and across both samples, so core members and those who answered the UCLA scale as well. And you can see the three groups of religious identity, frequency of attendance, and then meaning and purpose there. And if you look at this graph in terms of affiliation in this sample, 74% identified as Christian. And if you compare that with the ring, the donut I showed you right at the beginning, that was 43%. So this is a very religious group in the sense of their, of their identity. And 23% said they had no religion. And in the ONS, the donut I showed you in the beginning for England in 2021, that was 18%. And attendance was 48.4% for going to a place of worship, and almost the same for not going to a place of worship. So pretty even. And you can see any other religion and those who are unknown is very, very low compared to those who decided, yes, I do identify or I don't identify at all. And if we look at now religious practice prevalence, so those 4 questions on the importance, whether you pray and meditate daily, whether it gives you meaning and purpose or you're active, actually across both samples, they really strongly disagreed or disagreed with that. So for example, 76.9% disagreed that they were active in organised religion. So despite this very Christian identity, this split now shows you by just as a core member and when you answer all the loneliness questions, if you look at the red and the green, those are the people strongly disagreeing or disagreeing. And you can see that despite saying, yes, I'm a Christian, actually, I don't really look to the religion for those 4 items that are being asked. And that's why, again, it highlights the importance when you're looking at religion of not just simply identifying someone has it. It's where does that fit into the rest of, I guess, for me, their daily life and so that gave you an idea of the demographics and the prevalence and what we found in that population from that data set of over 6,000. And this was now looking at, actually, is there some sort of relationship there? Is there some statistical, is there some evidence to say that there is a correlation here, that if you do have either an identity or you attend somewhere or you have a belief, there might be some relationship with loneliness, positive or negative. And the one that only came out as statistically significant was whether you attended a place of worship. And what you'll see here, if you remember, I said I wanted to look at frequency. So if you went often, as well as if you just went at all and didn't. And in both cases, it was significant. So indicating that the more frequent you go, yes, that was better for not being lonely. But also if you just went, that also helps. So it's not to say that going more than once a week is any better than going once a year. So again, what does that mean? You see, again, it's that sort of interpretation of that. And so you can see here on these graphs with a bit of colour clash of the distribution of those here. So on the graph for those online, on the graph on the left there, we're looking at religious attendance between the 2 groups. So are you lonely or not lonely? And do you attend play? So you can see in the not lonely, they're very similar. And also in those who declare they are lonely, whether they attend or not is very similar as well. And then the graph on the right-hand side is telling you about frequency. And again, on the blue scale, you'll see the not lonely people. They're tending to, in terms of frequency, go more frequently than those who aren't lonely. But also there's a big chunk of them who just don't go at all. So now it gets even more complicated, doesn't it? Because now we put it into the regression. And again, for those who are not stats-based like me, we're looking to see a set of predictive variables, odds that respondents would report feeling lonely or not. So if you feed the machine with this data on, or the model with this data on religion, are you able to then say that religion has an effect on whether someone says they are lonely or not? We don't know what that effect is, but based on those variables, does that make a difference? And because these variables are so interrelated, we did this over several models and sort of blocks. So again, those who are familiar with statistics, they're entered in at certain levels. So the first block was just testing loneliness with religious identity, attendance and practice, so just on its own with none of those extra covariates that I mentioned. And then in models B, C, D and E, we're now looking to see, well, if you're female, does that make a difference? And if we're looking at health, if you're physically active, does that make a difference to your loneliness? And also social participation. If you're a member of a group or you go to a meeting, does that make a difference? And then if we put all of that together and everything into the model, what comes out? Is there still anything that's significant? So fortunately, I have the answers from the statistic, and this is not for you to look at in detail, but to just illustrate for those that are not familiar and how you enter this information and what you can have from that. But these summary slides really give you that in more granular detail. So if we just take block A, where we put in the answers to those 3 loneliness questions, we then find that with when those religious variables are added, that you get an odds ratio of 0.73, and that is significant. And that really signifies that religious attendance was significantly associated with the reduced odds of loneliness. So if you went to a place of worship, you were protected in a sense from being lonely. You would report that I am not lonely. If when you then added in those demographics, so your gender, your relationship, those sorts of things into the block as well, that attendance being protective of loneliness then disappeared. It wasn't important. Now what was important was if you were married, if you were employed, if you had enough money and your ethnicity. Then if we looked at whether health now made a difference, again, religion went out of the window, and now it became significant that with reporting good health was more important than that. And then finally, the same thing was with block 4. Attendance was no longer significant, but being a member of an organised committee was. And in the final block, when everything was entered all at once, marital status, income insufficiency, general health and ethnicity remain statistically predictors of loneliness, but none of those religious variables were. So the UK is happy because we know it's okay. Everyone is no longer saying that they're a certain religion or whatnot, because it's all fine. But here's the best part, right? This is where you get to tear apart all the data. We talked about in the beginning, how do you measure these constructs? There's not much information out there, and there's not much rigor in my view of what I saw, even internationally, where there's amazing research, but there's no real consensus like you have on some of these other validated scales. So it's difficult to draw meaningful and comparable conclusions with that. There are other loneliness scales as well. The 3 items, as some of you may know, came from kids. It was, and this is a simplified version of a 20-item scale, I believe. And so already you've narrowed something down very, very small, which is known. It's been validated in large studies. It makes it easy because, you know, if you're a participant in ALSA, you're being asked hundreds of questions. So having these small amounts is definitely, it's the way forward. But it does mean that something like another loneliness scale, which some might beyond Gearville, that explores that social, emotional and existential dimension. And I talked about that right in the beginning, about definitions about religion and spirituality and how this kind of encompasses all those different areas. And then again, in the demographics, you could see that this was disproportionately a white population. England, out of all the 4 nations, is the most ethnically diverse. Other religious groups, there's not an option for spiritual or atheist or agnostic groups. Also in the questionnaires, there are non-response bias. And looking further into that, what that means is people who've either not answered the question or just not sent the questionnaire back. And those people that don't send the questionnaire back, they tend to be the lower income insufficiency, not employed, the marriages, all those kind of variables. And so actually, they might be more lonely and their data is missing because it's not easier to get that kind of data, and that's really important to have, especially when you have a data set of over 6,000. Obviously, I've looked at a cross-sectional data point. If you think about yourself and loneliness, one day you can feel it, by the weekend you're happy, and so it's not something that you can take from just a single time point. And again, the circumstances, just putting yourself, I try to put myself as someone, as a participant on that day, and if in the next room kids' grandchildren were playing or something, and whereas another participant, maybe their partner has just passed away. So all these kind of factors that maybe you won't get from quantitative, but from, you know, from your qualitative, it would have been interesting to know more about that. And also the time available, do you have enough time? And then whilst we've set a threshold for loneliness as saying if you score 3 to 5, you're not, what's that? You know, Prof Victor has posed this question quite rightly. What is that grey area between a 5 and a 6? What is it that puts you over? What is it? You know, it's not just a numerical number, isn't it? And then finally, depression, which is known, it's a very important covariate of loneliness. But in ELSA, it's very difficult to get an accurate answer about this, the way that they ask the question. So it's asked in a roundabout way, have you got a diagnosis? So you have to kind of know if you have. And then also they use a self-report scale, the CESD. And so that's why I didn't include that in the study, but that could have well changed all of the findings as well. And so for further research in the crude models of just over 6,000, religious attendance remained significant, but in the adjusted models, as I showed you, it didn't. Instead, self-reported general health, sufficient income, and marriage or partnership were more protective. And that suggests in this population, so in this ELSA data set from England, social, economic, and health factors should be areas of focus to identify those at risk of loneliness, and not religion or spirituality. But again, we like the buts. Is it that those in better health, so that 76% who said, I've got really good health, they're able to travel to places of worship or spiritual activities. And so even though they may not have the whole practicing and the belief things, just being able to go when they feel like it gives them that social participation. And one of your colleagues was mentioning that, I think yourself, wasn't it, in the ICT, that, you know, the ICT, if you're lonely, isn't great because you don't feel that you belong to that community, that you can go along to that centre. And this might be the same kind of parity here, that actually you feel you can go there and you're able to go there, and your health makes that difference. And is it that religion and spirituality moderates loneliness through other mechanisms, such as it's like a coping strategy? So meditation is a form of coping, or for example, in my faith, people go for regular Friday prayers in mosques, and that feeling of sort of that sense of purpose, like I said, or is it actually just being in a social gathering? I feel like, you know, there's hundreds of people around me, I feel something there. And then finally, what about the potential negative effects of religion and spirituality on loneliness? And again, I can't present any data or robust evidence because we didn't even get to see about atheists. It's not sectioned out. But in general reading, for example, at end of life, there is sometimes this negative bias towards the healthcare for, say, people who are atheists, particularly if the caregiver might have strong religious beliefs. And whilst we shouldn't let that influence our care to anybody, unconsciously or consciously, it may do so. And likewise, for someone who has a religion, having a caregiver who understands that might make a difference in those last moments of life. And I think that comes to the sort of final conclusions as well, that this study's hopefully offered some new insights into the prevalence of religion and or spirituality in older adults in England. It's shown a statistically significant relationship between loneliness and attendance at the place of worship of at least once or more times a year being protective of feeling lonely. And it's not necessarily possible to exclude the associations of religion and spirituality and loneliness on robust evidence, given the limitations that I said. So it's worth doing more of. And so it shouldn't necessarily be reviewed, religion and spirituality shouldn't be viewed in isolation of other factors, but maybe complementary to personalised based healthcare. And so it was interesting in your architecture, I noticed that you had that plot of land, and you had this beautiful building, and you had the park, and actually you had a church next door. And it would have been interesting if that was to come to fruition, would you have multi-generational people using that facility? Because again, in Finland, I'm not sure on your data on religion and spirituality and so on. And again, talking about multi-generation, places of worship tend to be multi-generational as well. And then thinking about your access, when you were saying, and if you've got boulders in the road and so on, if you have a place of worship and you've got to enter it by stairs, there isn't a disability toilet. Is that what the issue is? It's not the religious part and so on. It's so just thinking along those lines. So interventions may benefit from research into loneliness across the life course in diverse religious or spiritual groups, identifying subgroup populations and their covariates that may promote social well-being and in turn healthy aging. Well, thank you.
Thank you. So I think Soureya's presentation raises lots of interesting points. So just for reference, when I was a very young researcher about 1 million years ago, there was a guy called Peter Coleman, who was a researcher at Southampton. He looked at bereavement outcomes in relation, and it was I was just remembered in response to whether people had a religious faith or not. And the people who had the best outcomes were either after their partner had died in terms of psychological well-being. The people who had best outcomes were either people who believed, because they believed, they had a faith. I can't remember whether it was various faiths, and because they believed they would be reunited with their partners in another life, and people who had no faith at all, and it was like, well, that's it, I'm never going to see them again, that's fine. And the people who were the ones who seemed to experience the worst psychological outcomes after bereavement were the people in the middle who, well, I might believe it, or I'm not entirely sure, but yeah, so I had a weak faith. So it's a really interesting topic. Anyway, do we have any questions in the room? Just
well, I can say first, thank you
for comments.
Yes, for the very extremely clear and interesting presentation. I think if I had to show my students what the presentation should look like, I would show yours.
It's a great teacher. That's I take all.
Hi.
Which we prevent people to declare loneliness because of this stigma, but isn't there as well a stigma when talking about religion and especially about religious practices, and especially among young people who perhaps have you found that, or have you reflected about that as well in your
Yeah, funny, I did actually reflect on that, and I did think it was surprising actually how many did still identify. And I wonder though if that's an age thing, because as you just clearly stated, younger people, there may be, and for many obvious reasons, the mean age in this sample I think was 68, and so yeah, definitely I'm sure there is something, and also in the UK this, and Prof might correct me on this, but I think they're leaning more to sort of a cultural assessment of people, which combines ethnicity and religion and other factors to create this kind of picture around that. So perhaps trying to reduce that as well, of just saying, declaring religion or not. But we still have it on, for example, in the workplace here in the UK, you're asked, do you have a religion, and you're asked to identify it, and you can obviously choose not to. But yeah, I'm sure there are people that don't declare for many obvious reasons.
Yeah, so in this case, this was part of the self-completion questionnaire, so you didn't have to reply to an interview or I'm whatever it is, but you're right, it's potentially a generational issue because the Church of England is the established church. If you ask people, what are you? For this cohort of people who are very predominantly kind of white, not perhaps there's some Jewish, few people in there, but very few people.
by default, probably a lot of this generation would just say, yeah, Church of England, so Christian, but so it'd be interesting to see how that changes as the younger generations become old. How do I know if I've got any questions?
I've suggested.
I don't know.
A few on speaker.
Okay, will they have heard that? Okay, Janet says I need to say, if anybody online has a question for Soureya, would you like to unmute yourself and ask it? And if not, you have to listen to me. So yeah, we don't seem to have anybody at the moment. Okay, so
So I want to know what for the future. Maybe this big more.
if somebody would fund us,
Okay.
we'd be delighted.
Yeah, it was interesting, especially your data around the mobility, the machine learning and showing where people were going. It would be really interesting to see something like that with places of worship and loneliness. And again, but almost combining those aspects of accessibility into community spaces and things like that. And there's definitely so much that you can explore.
And given your very positive response, I shall be encouraging Soureya to write this up, because I think it is an interesting topic area, and an area that we've, as I say, unlike our North American cousins, have tended not to include in our studies. It's important to make sure we address factors that even if we as researchers perhaps don't or do think are important. And also to maximise the use of the data. I mean, I'd be quite interested in looking at, if we could, longitudinally, does that make a difference? So maybe cross-sectionally it doesn't, but perhaps over time it may do if you're part of a community. So, but yeah, okay.
Is this a study based on like workplaces or an age group?
It's people aged 50 and over who are randomly sampled from the population.
So they're like their home. So they say
Yeah.
study private dwelling. So they do. I think they do nursing.
They do,
as well,
but
that's excluded in the data.
yeah.
So it's just people that are in their own homes and.
Yes, sorry, that question was about the sample from ELSA, so where they came from. We were just saying they're predominantly a community-based sample. People who start off in the cohort and then go into care homes are usually lost to the study, so it's a community dwelling group. Okay. Oh,
Just
yeah, no.
we don't separate.
No.
Roman Catholics are buried around, and there is a huge population of those who are aging Irish people as well. So it would be interesting to know how they felt about, if in another randomized thing, whether you could involve that, that separation.
So the question there was just drawing our attention to the specific Roman Catholic denomination. I think as whether we have any information on them and whether they have a particular devotion.
So it's an excellent question, and again, because I've only looked at a certain set of questions, but because they ask so many, there's only so much they can have time for as well, I think, for people to take options and meet the end of the questionnaire. But certainly, unfortunately, ELSA doesn't really get that detailed breakdown. Yeah. And even religion, it's very hard to find it, because they generally just say, has someone got a faith or not got a faith? But certainly one of the advantages now going forward in their next waves, they are widening the ethnicity and the records and so on. So maybe going forward, it would be good to see if they are representing travellers or the Irish, or as you say, the different denominations. And perhaps that is why, although it's 74%, it might be high because of all of the groups that are in the Christian faith, and under that umbrella.
Yeah. So it's a very, ELSA is a very specific sample, but you're right, the Irish population is the largest ethnic minority, it's single ethnic minority group in the UK, and who are often overlooked. And particularly now we've got the ageing of all those men who came over and worked on the road, built the motorways and all of those kinds of things. So particularly interesting group, but
I suppose you could also consider Tilda for that.
yeah, I don't know what other, yeah. So there's the Irish longitudinal study of ageing, which is called, so there are two in Ireland because there's one in the north and one in the south, as with all things. So one's called Tilda, which is the one in Era, and then there's Nicola, which is the Northern Ireland one. And I have no idea what questions they ask about religion, but it would be something to look at. Yeah. Thank you. We'll consider. Any other questions? Thank you, Soureya. And excellent. You can do my lectures for me. Okay. Tell you what I know, which is not necessarily not. So this is a slightly different element of the work that we've been doing, and this is a project called Happy to Chat, which is led by my colleague Dorothy Yen in the business school, who can't be here today and has given me the responsibility of presenting it. I'm part of the team, and this is a project which is looking to not just okay, we don't want that one. Okay, so she's heard me and colleagues talk a lot about loneliness, but she's more of a problem solver than I am. So thinking about a lot of the work we know about loneliness, that it affects everybody, but the focus is often on older adults to the neglect of other age groups, and it is associated with a number of poor outcomes. And so she got interested in thinking, well, what can we do about it? Not what, why Christina needs to do yet another study on something. And thinking about, rather than a lot of the work in the UK, the interventions for loneliness, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, have focused on particular groups, particularly older people. We're still trying to raise consciousness amongst many people that it's not just a problem of older people, but there are other groups. So young adults, we could say students who come to university, people who have chronic illnesses or disabilities, particular groups with particular identities, and that some or all of these factors can influence or challenge people's ability to engage in kind of social activities. So I say this is Dorothy's kind of idea. When we look at a lot of loneliness interventions, I just put some of my favourite pet hates on this slide. So one of which is people trying to find a pill for loneliness. No, we don't want to do that. The kinds of things we tend to suggest is that people go somewhere with other lonely people to do things. So my particular dislike is the chicken things. Chickens are not strokeable things. They are vicious creatures. And if I was going to pet something, it definitely wouldn't be a chicken. So we take people and expose them to an intervention with lots of lonely people, other lonely people, and hope they'll get better. So I have to identify or be identified as lonely, go somewhere, do something, and then I won't be lonely. And there are all sorts of different things. And I think Dorothy and some other colleagues thought about it differently. But instead of having interventions that are designed like that, can we not in some way develop interventions that we can embed within normal daily life in public settings to try and perhaps encourage those kinds of micro social connections. Because I think a lot of, sometimes when we think about loneliness, we think about deep and lasting and deep and meaningful connections, but a lot of our daily life is made up of these micro connections where we talk to the person at the bus stop. So thinking about the problem differently to try and think, well, can we change how people interact outside or in public spaces? And the importance of public spaces and places to foster a more positive set of social connections to address loneliness that way. So this is the solution from Dorothy and the team is to have a happy to chat badge. And here you can see on my back, have a happy to chat badge. I should have brought some with me. So a very simple kind of intervention. So we have had lonely benches. So you go to a bench and somebody will talk to you, but you have to say, I'm kind of a lonely person and I want to talk to you. Whereas maybe somebody just wandering around with a badge and chatting to you might be a different way of trying to foster a more connected community. So, oh, I didn't know I was going to do that. So we are using the royal we, so that's Dorothy, with help from some others. We started off by asking people, some of our people we know through our older people's group and other groups, was what do you we think this is a great idea. You wear a badge saying, I'm happy to chat. What do you guys think? Because obviously we're a bunch of academics. We think we have these brilliant ideas that, of course, are the real world says, no, this is not a good idea. So we tried it out and we had some feedback from our initial wearers about they wanted issues around perhaps feeling embarrassed about going up and talking to people, some concerns about safety. Obviously, we have to be aware of that. And but there was sufficient positive feedback from our pilot testers that we thought we could address these kinds of things. And I'm realizing that I should have bought you copies of this. So Dorothy and her team, and you can see some nice design things, put together a pack that we would give to people. So we give the people a badge that they can wear in public spaces, but with a set of some guidance around how to use it. And also, you can see for here, if they talk to somebody and they're concerned about them, they can they can provide advice. So if somebody says, I feel terrible, or my husband's beating me, or my daughter's beating me, or whatever it is, we can direct people to particular helpline. So we support the people who are out wearing their badge. And here we are, we've got lots of different characters, lots of different badges for people to wear. And we have had support from not just from the university, but from the local shopping centre and a few other voluntary groups. So, and I can maybe send people copies. So here you are. And we have in the shopping centre is the Pavilion Shopping Centre in the town centre, which if you're going to the railway station or the tube station, you'll see is what's called a safe haven. So you can go in there. If you go in there and talk to one of the security guys, they'll say, this guy's following me, or whatever it is. It's a place of safety. So we've thought about risk mitigation for the people who are wearing these things. But as we say, it's not for everybody. I should have put this one at the end, because here are a series of links where you can learn more about it. So we've been doing some pilot testing, and we're interested in how people who are being chatted to feel about it, but also the person who's initiating the conversation. So we've effectively had 43 volunteers, and they've filled out a number of questionnaires, and then we gave the packs were trialed for a couple of months, and then I've just spotted a typo, and then we reanalyzed the data for the people who are doing the chatting, so the badge wearers. And then we also interviewed them to see what they thought their experience was like. So predominantly female, but a range of different age groups. So this is not an intervention necessarily for older people, it's for anybody. And I thought it was kind of interesting. We asked people what they felt about wearing it, and obviously this is a self-selected group of people. So these are people who didn't mind being approached by people when they were wearing the badge. And I guess as well, as we're now post-COVID, a lot of us didn't go out anywhere for 3 years. So whereas in the past we might have made casual remarks to people, when we were in the queue for the train or the till at Tesco's or whatever, perhaps we've forgotten some of those things during COVID and post-COVID. So to some degree, it acts as an icebreaker. People feel they've got permission to say, "Oh, how are you feeling?" kinds of things. So there was a lot of, I think the people who wore it were felt it was quite a positive experience, but of course, they're the people who wanted to do it. And we just asked where they wore them. So basically in public places where there are people around, so parks and on the bus and on public transport and those kinds of things. And we asked them, I guess, what their motivation was. So they all felt that the person they talked to got something out of it, but of course we haven't got any data about the recipients of the intervention. That will be the next phase. This is obviously a staged kind of process, testing out whether this is a good idea. And I think the participant see there at the bottom of the white participate. It's not just something for older people. It's something for everybody. I mean, we did do some analysis of the people who were the badge wearers, and they all benefited immensely from doing it. They all had their sort of quality of life, if you like, or happiness increased doing it. So if it didn't benefit the people they were talking to, the talkers certainly felt they benefited from it. So maybe that's as good a reason to carry on with it as anything else. I mean, we were concerned about whether people would feel unsafe, but it's quite, I think they were quite circumspect in how they used the badges and did it in places where they felt that it was appropriate and safe to do so for both parties. But and we asked them would they carry on wearing it if we wanted to, but So there was one there who felt they didn't need a badge to chat, as apparently they're chatty enough anyway. But I think that does raise a point that if you're wearing it, if somebody approaches you, they felt the obligation then to engage, and perhaps sometimes they might not want to. So there's certainly some data to think about, and we asked people, would you recommend other people to do it, and to get involved in this idea of just engaging in these micro conversations. And again, we don't necessarily claim this is representative, but there was certainly seemed to think it was a positive kind of thing to do. And I think this is I think the comment from the participant at the bottom was exactly where this was kind of going, that it's just a little nudge. It's a way of legitimizing opening a conversation with somebody about. It's not deep and meaningful about. It's about how you feeling, weather's terrible, queues too long. All of those micro conversations, I think we've forgotten about during COVID. So and I say that Dorothy is spearheading this. We're trying to scale up and do a more rigorous study, because of course we're working with volunteers. How do we know? And we need to look at what it's like from the person who's the recipient of the conversation, which is a bit trickier to sort out methodologically, yeah. And if anybody's around, so you may have to come over again from Finland to come. We are running an event in the Pavilions shopping centre. So if any Brunel staff here want to come down and have a cup of tea, and I think it's a cup of tea and a donut, but good. As a public health practitioner, I'm clearly promoting donuts and and crisps. So I'll be drummed out of the Faculty of Public Health. So we're just trying to develop this idea as perhaps a different approach from a lot of the interventions that have tried to address loneliness and have by and large all dismally failed to have any impact whatsoever. I think there's no point in repeating the kind of approach that clearly hasn't shown anything, and maybe what we need to do instead of getting people to stroke chickens is actually to create environments in public spaces where people can have conversations without being in a positive way. And I'll conclude there, I think. Thank you. And I'm happy to take any questions or comments or suggestions, which I will feed back to Dorothy. I am simply the mouthpiece. I'm sorry we haven't got any. I'll make sure we send some over. Yeah. 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 I think, yeah. Potentially. It gives people permission to do things which I think we have become perhaps less willing to do post-COVID. We've got Welsh versions. I don't think we've got a Finnish one. You have to write down what happy to chat is in Finnish. And yeah. Okay.
Put this slow cashier in the
Yeah.
supermarket. So there is the fast cashers, but then there is one slow one where you can just stay for a few minutes.
Yeah.
With the cashier.
Yeah,
And just take your time to pay, and there's no hurry. And it's
Yeah.
kind of, this kind of simple ideas.
yeah,
Interesting things.
yeah. I think there have been some of those in the UK, but I'm not 100%.
Some things where people with dementia or it's dementia friendly area where they not encourages people to be tolerant.
Yeah. So I know they do have in some cafes, don't they, a table where you can sit at, but it's like you have to identify, I am a lonely person and I'm going to sit there, rather than the more, maybe they should have happy to chat tables rather than. But I don't know whether that would be worth trying, whether that works, because they certainly have chatty carriages on trains and chatty benches, but you kind of have to go there and identify. Yeah, whereas.
As I finished space, thinking this would be ideal. Because you've already got identified benches, haven't you?
Yeah.
So to actually have somebody sitting there, which would really be inviting. Yes.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, no. Yeah, well, online people come in person next. Yeah. So, given my very bad chairing, for which I will, I'll write lines and give myself detention. Does anybody online care to unmute themselves and ask a question? Well, it's not obligatory. Okay. I'll ask a second time, just to make sure that nobody wants to ask a question, which is fine. Okay, all good. In which case, we can carry on the conversations informally, or we can all go home and get ready for the weekend. Thank you very much for coming along.